evening. My name is Roberta Phillips, and I'm the CEO of the Prince George's County Memorial Library System. It is my pleasure to introduce tonight's event, which is co-presented with the Prince George's County Human Relations Commission, the county's Arts and Humanities Council, the Black Caucus of the American Library Association, and our friends at Loyalty Bookstores. Special thanks to the following libraries for supporting tonight's program: Anne Arundel County Public Library, Carroll County Public Library, Howard County Library System, Kent County Public Library, Ruth Enlow Library of Garrett County, and Worcester County Library. We are honored to be hosting one of our nation's most gifted poets this evening. Natasha Trethewey, I heard her say her Canadian version, so now I'm like stumbling, I'm sorry, served 2 terms as the 19th Poet Laureate of the United States, and her latest book, Memorial Drive, is a memoir and finalist for the Carnegie Medal. She is the author of 5 collections of poetry, including Monument, which was longlisted for the 2018 National Book Award, and Native Guard in 2006, for which she was awarded the Pulitzer Prize. She is the recipient of fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, the Guggenheim Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Beinecke Library at Yale, and the Bunting Fellowship Program of the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study at Harvard. At Northwestern University, she is a Board of Trustees professor of English in the Weinberg College of Arts and Sciences. Natasha's writing touches the soul of America. In all of its light and darkness, and her artful way with words helps us all find our truths. I highly recommend listening to her own reading of Memorial Drive in audiobook. You can borrow Natasha's books from PGCMLS or purchase them for Loyalty Books via the links you'll see in the chat. Our moderator this evening is our own Sistah Joy Alford, who is the Poet Laureate here in Prince George's County, Maryland. Thanks for joining us, and please enjoy the program.
Well, good afternoon. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome, Natasha Trethewey.
Hello there.
It's fabulous to see you again, and I'm excited to be able to share with listeners and viewers your story. And it is quite a story indeed. But then again, it's your life. I want to first thank the library for this fabulous opportunity. And I want to thank you too, Natasha, for doing this, because there's much to be gleaned and learned from your story. Certainly as writers, we're very intrigued and interested. But as women of color, women at this time in history, we thank you for being with us and sharing this. So of course, your story touches hearts. It awakens minds. It brings to the fore the need for consciousness and for us to be woke, as it is stated these days. And with all of everything that your story entails, an incredulous story, it's your life. So why don't we? This discussion is going to be about you, but we're going to anchor it around Memorial Drive, the book. So I want to first acknowledge that there'll be many who already know your story, many who already know your work. But for the benefit of those who are coming to learn more about you, why don't you tell us, what is it that's brought you to poetry, and what is it that you think brought you to not just poetry, but to education? So you're a poet, you're a writer, you're an educator. Tell us, how did Natasha Trethewey become?
Well, you know, I often quote W.H. Auden in his poem, his memorial to William Butler Yeats, in which he writes, "Mad Ireland hurt you into poetry." Likewise, my native land, my South, my Mississippi, with its brutal history of violence and racial oppression, inflicted my first wound. But my deeper wound my deepest existential wound, the wound that really made me a poet, was losing my mother when I was 19, which is what this book, Memorial Drive, is about.
Yes, yes. Okay. So, and since you jumped right to the crux of it, as it were, there is a reference in your book that I had not read about, but I know personally about, and you reference the concept of missing memory. Now, your story, of course, could be told through many lenses, as it were, but when you talk about the phenomenon of missing memory, can you share with our viewers and listeners what that means, and when was it that you decided to write this story, this particular story about you connecting America with the story of your mother, because it's so huge.
Well, I have spent most of my adult life since I was 19 and my mother was killed trying to forget those difficult years in Atlanta. After we left Mississippi, my parents divorced and my mother remarried, and we were in the house with her second husband for 10 difficult years.
Mhm.
And then we got away and she divorced. She was able to get a divorce, but he continued to stalk her
Mhm.
for nearly 2 more years before he finally killed her. So I've tried most of my life to forget that. And of course, what I realized is that in trying to forget so much of that and to bury so much that was too painful to remember, I let go and lost a lot of my mother.
Yes.
The parts about our lives that I would have very much wanted to be able to remember.
Yes.
So the reason I had to write this book is that, with my own increasing career recognition, journalists started to write about me. And when they wrote about me, my backstory became part of the story. And in my backstory, when they wrote about it, they'd often mention my mother as only a footnote. She'd be described as merely a victim, a murdered woman. And I felt that she was being erased and that people did not understand that I am the person and the writer that I am today because of her. Because of her, all the years that I had her, and then the impact of her death on my becoming a writer.
So now, when you talk about, was it the memories that prompted the book, or did the book prompt the memories?
Sorry, well, well, I had to try to recover so much that I'd lost. And there were a couple of ways that I was able to do that. One, my father gave me, before he died, all of the letters that my mother wrote to him during their courtship back in the 60s, through their marriage when he was away at sea, and even after they divorced and we moved to Atlanta, she would write to him to let him know how I was doing. And so I had all of that. I also had, well, I also had, because of a chance encounter, the entire file, the court records, the police records, her autopsy. Those were things that I was given, that I was able to fill in some of the gaps, things that I might not have known. But then I also found that in the process of writing, things that I had forgotten came back to me.
Mhm.
For example, there was a moment that I was writing about being in New Orleans with my mother. And I think maybe even just the motion of writing made certain things, images, words come back to me that I hadn't thought of. And I heard myself saying Godchall's, D.H. Holmes, Maison Blanche, which were the names of department stores in New Orleans that I
Okay.
hadn't said in years, that, you know, my mother and I used to go to those department stores. And so piece by piece, little by little, I got things back that I'd forgotten.
That you had forgotten. Okay. And when that journey of recall, um, I don't know, as I was reading, certainly Monument, uh, Memorial Drive, not Monument, because I read both, but Memorial Drive, there were historical references, cultural references, certainly connecting with the civil rights struggle from years gone by up through today. And there's so much that remains unchanged. Can you talk about, as a writer, how where do you find yourself, and how do you present the issues that are relevant to so many, uh, even though you're writing through the lens of an intimate experience? You have so much for us.
Well, you know, I think about um, James Baldwin, who said that the story of the Negro in America is the story of America.
Yes,
And so I have thought, and I think known for a long time, that my personal history was history writ
yes,
large. Um, it's one of the reasons that, you know, I have a poem called Miscegenation, which is, you know, about my parents having to um, leave Mississippi and break two laws in order to get married.
absolutely.
Um,
You identify yourself as persona non grata as
right.
a result of that, and during that time, growing up in that southern climate, if we will,
Hmm.
just use a nice word.
Yeah.
Uh, how did that, do you feel, uh, contribute to your awareness that caused you to capture things and present them through poetry, but even through the creative process as a whole?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, I've been paying attention, you know, close attention, I think, in the way that children have to learn to do in order to be safe. You know, coming from a place like Mississippi at the time that I was born, you know, I was born on Confederate Memorial Day. From the moment I was born, there was the onslaught of um, both literal and metaphorical, figurative forms of white supremacy everywhere, from the Confederate flag flying and part of Mississippi's flag to all the monuments to Confederate soldiers and Klansmen and governors, all of them, you know, often the same. Um, that's something that when you see it constantly, um, I feel like I was prepared early on to watch very closely, and this is something my mother wanted to prepare me
Mhm.
um, for where the onslaught was coming from, where the danger. And I think when you begin to look at the world like that, to look closely,
Right.
it translates to the kind of precision that one can bring to poetry and to storytelling, because you're seeing um, both things for as they are literally, but the
Mhm.
figurative possibilities and what they can tell us, the kind of, you know, to use Ezra Pound's phrase, luminous details that show us not just, you know, the moment that we're in, but something larger about history, about the circumjacent conditions in history and in law. um, you know, as you said, I use the phrase persona non grata because indeed I was illegal when I was born.
Very
And
exist.
the idea of that, um, what it is to be illegal is something that has visited us yet again. You know, as we're fighting about the language used about human beings, you know, no one is illegal. And
Right.
yet that was the language used for me. The language used in anti-miscegenation circles is the same language that they began to use about same-sex marriage. So we just see these things repeating themselves, repackaged and manufactured for a new age,
Mhm.
but it's not new.
It's not new, not new at all. Okay. One of the things that struck me, and I have to confess that I read your story through tears. I absolutely did, and I see even your sharing with us today is difficult, and my heart goes out to you. And I do understand that there is a reason for you to choose to do this. This is by choice, and it's I'm sure it's cathartic, as well as just there are many who. Are holding on to hope through messages such as what you've shared here. Um, One of the things that was very perplexing to me, and this is kind of going back to your childhood years, when you talk about uh, the traumatic experiences that you sustained or survived, endured uh, with Big Joe, that you never told your mother about at the time. And that was such a significant thing for a child to consciously make that decision. Can you talk about, or do you have the recollection of how you came to the decision not to confide in your mother, who was extremely protective of you? She absolutely, but can you talk about
Mhm.
those traumatic experiences?
You know, when I think about it, it doesn't feel like a choice, like a conscious choice I was making. Um, I had a conversation with someone not too long ago who said to me that the remarkable thing about abusers, um, people who abuse children, is that they don't have to tell them not to tell.
Yeah,
Somehow, just the fear that they instill is perhaps enough.
controlling.
Yeah, it is. It is psychological and emotional. Um, and I write in the book that I did remember thinking that I was a good child and that my place was to accept the life that the adults in my world were making for me, that I could, bear his psychological torment of me and not burden my mother with it, who seemed to have her own trials with him. And it wasn't until, that moment that, I was senior in high school and my mother and I walked up the street together and she held my hand and she was swinging it as if I were a little girl. And that's when I started telling her everything.
Yeah,
But before that, the only time I tried to say anything to her, when I was in the fifth grade, and I realized for the first time um, that he was hitting her, and I wanted to let her know that I knew.
yeah.
I think I believed that would make it stop.
So with let's move to those persons, the extended family that were so supportive of you. Can you talk about who some of those pivotal uh, persons, women in particular, but persons in your family that contributed to the successful and beautiful and powerful woman that you are today? Can you talk a little bit about them?
I think if I hadn't had them, if I hadn't had the fierce love of not only my mother and father, but of her extended family, my grandmother and my grandmother's siblings, my great uncle, son, and my great aunt Sugar, and my great uncle's son's wife, Aunt Lizzie. Um, that fierce love, I think, creates a way for resilience to bloom inside of you. Um, they uh, they really did adore me, just like they adored my mother.
That was
And
that was so touching as I was reading it. I could feel that through your word choice, through the way you conveyed. I just said, there are two extreme polarizations at play here simultaneously.
right,
And as much as my heart was breaking, I could feel that I see why you're okay. I mean, I do, and that's a blessing, and that's a blessing. And you told that part of your family connection so beautifully. So thank you
thank
for
you.
that.
You know,
Yes,
I wanted to. It took me the longest to write that first chapter, Another Country.
yes.
And I think it really is because I didn't want to leave there. I didn't want to leave the memory of that place in the writing because I knew what I had to write next. I knew what was coming.
Okay. Well, let's back off a little bit and talk about you as a writer today. Um, are there uh, is there mentoring in your life? Are you mentoring, say, young poets, or as an educator? How do you approach uh, working with young people that may or may not be interested in being a poet, but that come to you as both poet laureate, woman of excellence, just writer in general? What is it that you feel that you are best at, and what type of mentoring do you do?
I think I'd like to believe that I am best at talking to young people about taking charge of their own stories. You know, whether you're going to become a writer or not,
Yes.
being able to write your own story, because we all tell ourselves stories about our lives, about
So,
the meaning and purpose of our lives, the arc of our lives. And I firmly believe that being able to be in control of that story, of the telling, is one of the things that also can help us not only survive but also thrive. Um, I do work primarily with uh, students who are on their way to becoming poets, who are trying to learn their craft in different ways.
okay.
Um,
Okay. And tell us about what authors and what books are significant in the life of Natasha Trethewey.
oh gosh, there are countless books that are important to me. But I this is something that I keep with me all the time. You know, one of my absolute favorite novelists in the entire world was Toni Morrison, and she is uh, still to me a guiding light. And I mean that because I often think that a writer has to deal with difficult knowledge, has to deal with hard truths and saying things that make people uncomfortable. Even as literature can make us feel better, even the most difficult things, it's not the aim of it simply to make you feel good or to tell you something you want to hear. And I always used to think that um, it's hard to stand up in front of a room and say things, talk about white supremacy, for example, reading poems about white supremacy or the things that I've written about. Because you want an audience to like you. But I often told myself that if Toni Morrison had really cared whether we liked her or not, she never would have written the things that she wrote.
Not at
And so
all.
whenever I worry standing in front of an audience about whether they're going to like me or not, I try to channel my inner Toni Morrison.
So that's a very good compass to always true north. Toni Morrison. I love it. I love it. Okay. I want to, let's see, when we talk about your experience as a biracial child in the South and today as a biracial woman in America, uh, in this on this planet, um, what are some of the things that you feel as we are faced with so many issues from Ferguson to Black Lives Matter? What are some of the issues that you feel are significant from your vantage point uh, that can help, I would say, lend to a conversation of bridge building in America? That's a big question, I realize, but.
Well, I have thought of myself my whole life as a Black person,
Okay.
as a Black person with a white father,
Okay.
um, which is it is a little different. I mean, so I'll try to explain what I mean. So on the one hand, growing up, white people were always asking me, "What are you?" Um, or "What nationality are you?"
Yeah.
And I would say, "Well, I'm an American, but what you want to know is why I look like this,
You're right.
because it doesn't fit your idea about what Black people look like. So let me just explain that to you." Um, I have always thought of, and this may be controversial, but this has been my experience. I have refused to simply say that I am a biracial person as opposed to saying that I am a Black person, because so often the idea of that is comforting to people in the wrong sort of way. And what I mean by that is it can be seen as an attempt to abandon or move farther away from Blackness. It is anti-Black, I think,
Okay.
in some people's estimation. I am not. I am, when I would hear white people say to me, "Well, you're not like the rest of them,"
Oh, yeah.
I would say, "Well, who are the rest of them? My mother? My grandmother?"
Right.
So to me, it was a more just and particularly um, useful thing to do to be Black and not um, and to identify with what some people consider the despised part of the self, because they were always saying things like, "Well, why do you say you're Black when you don't have to? Because we don't really think of you like them." That would infuriate me.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I do find that, you know, it is a difficult conversation to have, but I started having it with my own beloved father. I mean, my father
That was my
loved
next
me.
question.
Yeah, my father loved me dearly, but it was still hard for him, to completely unyoke himself from deeply ingrained and unexamined notions of racial difference and racial hierarchy that
Right.
were first codified during the Enlightenment and are manifest even now, and I think are the bedrocks of contemporary forms of white supremacy. And people don't like the phrase white supremacy, but let me soften it by saying, if you believe in racial hierarchies and racial difference, that is the bedrock of white supremacy. And my father could love me, but also harbor those ideas.
Yes. I'm I'm struggling to not contribute to that conversation because this is your interview. But I'm
Please do.
no, these discussions perhaps we'll have some offline. But with regard to the conversations within your family between the three of you, did that ever happen to bridge that understanding of how you found yourself to be between both mother and father? And was there ever a very open dialogue within your family? Admittedly, it would have been early years.
Well, together, when I asked my parents about race and why we didn't look the same, they just gave that same answer again and again. You have the best of both worlds.
Right.
And it wasn't until later that I began to have conversations with my father after my mother was gone. My father, for the longest time, believed that I could be halfway between them, that I could be biracial, that there wasn't going to be a cultural imperative or a cultural imposition on my identity, that it would be safer for me to make up my own mind and to assert myself. But I had a very, I think, public, private conversation with my father when I wrote my book, Thrall,
Right.
which is dedicated to him. And it's a conversation about these ideas about race and difference in the only language that he would really listen to, poetry.
Okay. So one of my questions was going to be, what was the role of your biological father in either helping or hindering your ability to navigate the issues of betrayal, rage, trauma, and loss? Can you speak to that?
Oh, well, I was fortunate to have my father who also, continued to love my mother dearly. It was sad to see him in later years, how often he would say that if Gwen were still alive, they'd get back together.
Mm-hmm.
I think he wanted that. He would say, if he'd been a better husband, she'd be alive today. But my father was also one of my first teachers. When I went to graduate school, I was in his workshop.
Oh, literally, not just as a father.
Literally, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, so it was, my whole life, him sort of talking to me about metaphors and figurative language, reciting poetry to me, and mythology, as early as I can remember. But he was actually one of my teachers when I went to graduate school. And I learned so much about the sounds of poetry, what was important, what a poem could do,
Right.
and should do, from my father.
Okay. Well, let's shift back to just the very broad umbrella of domestic violence. Today, it is as much an issue as it ever was, and certainly during this pandemic, we see the surge happening so very broadly. So when we talk about domestic violence, what would you say? I mean, I think the term was, in your mother's case, a perfect victim, in that she did everything that she was supposed to do, step one, step two, all the way through. And yet, so when we talk about domestic violence for contemporary times, what would you say is, whether it's the lesson learned or the lesson that continues to not be learned, what would you offer to viewers?
Well, that is a difficult term, and I know some people don't like to use it. It is one of those terms that in some organizations that are working to prevent domestic violence have used perfect victim. And as you say, my mother was perfect because she did everything right. She was also well educated.
Absolutely.
She had friends and family who loved her. She had resources. She was a professional woman. She was not dependent on her abuser for shelter or the care of her children. And so, if a woman like my mother, with all of that and doing everything right, can't get away, how can we tell women who are not in that situation that they can get away too?
Right.
Especially given that the statistics show that a woman is more likely to die when she leaves than
Yeah.
when she stays.
And when she stays.
So I think it's important that people are disabused of all of the mistaken notions they have about domestic violence and victims of domestic violence. Too often you hear people say, well, why didn't she just leave? Or, well, she made her bed, she should lie in it. Or, why is it the court's responsibility to do anything to protect her? All those kinds of things that people say because they don't really know or understand.
Right.
Or even questions about the role of police in handling calls for domestic violence. I hear often that, you know, they don't really want to go because the women are just going to go back to their abusers anyway. My mother, in the book, I actually use one of her own statements, uh, a document that she was writing that was found in her briefcase the morning that she was murdered, in which she's describing her own experience in going to the shelter for battered women. And she talks about a night that he's tormenting her. They're sitting at the kitchen table, and he tells her he's gotten a gun. And he jumps up from the table to run outside, and she thinks he's going to the car to get it.
Right.
So she gets up and locks the door behind him and calls the police. And when the police come, Joel is convincing them that he would never harm her, that he would never do anything like that. And as my mother writes, the police leave and they're all smiles. Um, and perhaps they're thinking, well, she didn't press charges right then and there, so maybe she really wanted to go back to him, instead of realizing that she might have just been terrified because if they take him and then he gets out a few days later on bail or whatever, he's just going to come and do what he started doing in the first place. So when they went back in the house, he looked at her chillingly and said, if you ever call the police on me again, I will kill you.
Mhm. Okay. The story is your life. The story is that of a successful woman who is a leader in so many regards, truly a beacon for many. And when I think about women, contemporary women, young, vibrant, vital women such as yourself, looking at young children, young girls in particular, what message would you share to mothers and fathers of young girls that would be about safekeeping?
Well, you know, I've often read about how the third grade is a crucial year in a child's life. That's the moment where the rest of your future can be decided
Mhm.
based on the kind of education you're getting, both at home and in school. So one thing I would suggest is, because I remember my own third grade experience, that is the moment that I was writing poetry in a classroom. I went to all black schools for most of my elementary school years, where we got to study African American history and culture year round, not just in February.
Right.
And my third grade teacher and the librarian bound a little volume of my poems and put them in the library and made me feel like I could be a poet.
Right.
That was a crucial year. I think it's also crucial to continue to encourage, especially girls, um, to be the conductors of their own educations, to be fierce about them, to be vocal. I remember reading that at one point in high school, girls start losing their confidence in classrooms.
Right.
Um, and that if we could, and happily, it looked to me that black girls lost it last, like we
Last.
kept it longer. So let's just keep it forever. Let's not lose it at all.
Absolutely. So, with regard to community building, bridge building from church to school to home to all of that network that, of course, how many times do we hear it takes a village? And truly, the extended family, most often in in our culture, is the village. But when we talk about in today's society, the exposure is so great, and we cannot isolate our children, even for safety's sake. So how do we connect in that way that is about uplift? How do we connect the family to the school, to the church, beyond the, it used to be, it used to be before COVID, the Monday through Friday for school and the Sunday and possibly Saturday for church, and family when in between. But how do we build that nucleus that is, in fact, what will save our children when we're talking about all of the missing young Black girls and the um, illegals where they just don't have access because opportunities are not given? What can we do as a society, even as a culture within the Black community? What can we do?
Wow, that's such a hard question. You know, I I think about um, my own childhood, and in some ways, it's almost as if you're describing something that has been steadily vanishing. Um, that community that I described in North Gulfport, Mississippi, the way it existed for so long before the elders were dying off, um, is something that I imagine that we can create in different ways. Um, there are so many young people who are, I think, social activists who are doing the kind of work for communities. Um, I know that I carry with me uh, something of those old timey folks that I grew up with in Mississippi, where I still see it as my duty
Yes.
to rear, uh, to uh, encourage, to nurture children when I see them. Um, I think if we all continue to think of that as our collective duty and not simply silo ourselves
All right.
and think that our duties are only to our immediate own. Our duties are to all children.
So, do you see yourself ever writing a book for young girls? Is that something? I mean, clearly, I'm interjecting some of my own passions here, but I had to ask. You're clearly such a woman of empathy and compassion, and you have so much to offer. And is that something that perhaps at some point?
You know, I don't think I'd ever thought about it. But uh, you know, there is a way that if I were to write uh, a book to my younger self, to the things that I would say to myself, it would be the things that I would say to other young girls if I were writing that book.
That was one of the things that I had to reflect on as I closed your book, Memorial Drive. I said, oh my gosh, there's so much that this book literally could have been twice the size. That was my first thing. I closed the book. I didn't want to be at the end because I wanted to still be with you. And the notion of there's so much that you have to give for you to be so strong that you could even write Memorial Drive. First of all, if I were wearing a hat, I would do it right now. Thank you. Thank you so much. And I just, this clearly is not a book for a young person, but it is a book about a young person who grows into a phenomenal woman. And that journey is one that, although nobody wants to emulate the hard time, but what must you have within you to go from there to where you are today? I'm a woman of faith, so I know what part of that must be. But also, clearly, you've done the work. You're doing the work. And we are so very appreciative of that. I'd like to ask a question, and I hope I don't evoke more tears. I just feel terrible.
It's okay.
Okay,
it's the
so
territory.
if your mother were to read this book, what message would you want her to walk away with? I'm sorry. Is that too much? If it is, please just tell me. And maybe what I'll do is back up and say, what is the overriding message that you want, aside from conveying your story? What would you want readers to, when they close the book and press it to their heart, as I know I did, and anyone with a soul would, what would you want the message to be from Natasha Trethewey?
You know, I use 2 lines from Shakespeare's sonnet number 3. Thou art thy mother's glass, and she in thee calls back the lovely April of her prime. What I'd want readers to know is that if you want to know anything about my mother, about how remarkable she was, you need only look at what she made.
Yes. Thank you. Well, thank you, Natasha Trethewey. I don't know if we have an opportunity for questions through the chat. I know I've seen a few comments coming across the screen as we were talking, but I'm going to ask you, is there something that you would like to share that I haven't touched on that is significant for you?
Well, I'd only like to say that how grateful I am to be talking to you, to imagine that there are people out there listening who are getting to know a little bit more about my mother,
Yes.
this woman that I have devoted my life to honoring. It may look like it's awful, but this is also joy.
Absolutely, absolutely. To lift up one's mother has to be joy, and I think you've done it beautifully, poignantly, and I I know this is the year that the book came out, and this is something that you're going to be traveling, conveying from your heart, and I lift prayers for you, literally, because this journey that you're on is not easy, but you've determined that it's important, and I thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this today. The viewers who are with us, and I have no clue of who our viewers are. Let's see, is there a question? A question from somebody, how do you feel about yourself today? That's the question from one of our viewers. How do you feel about yourself today?
You know, I can't imagine who I'd be without all the things that have happened to me. And that means that, as strange as it may seem, I wouldn't change my life because I like who I am. And I wouldn't exist as the person I am without all the things that have happened.
Yes, we are an accumulation of our experiences, and that is so true. Well, thank you for sharing your book, your story, and your soul with us tonight. I mean, truly, I know I'll read the book again. It's and for our viewers and those who don't yet have it, please go out. You will not be disappointed. You've heard much tonight, but let's see. There's another question. Okay, let's see. No, yeah. So basically, it's a phenomenal book. It won't take long to read it because you won't want to put it down. I'm not really here to be the hawk, to say buy the book, buy the book, buy the book. But I think just by virtue of what we've shared tonight, you can see why this is a must read. It's a phenomenal book by a phenomenal author, and we're very honored, Natasha Trethewey, for this experience. And I have to say, although I'd met you before, this by far is ranks quite high on my literary list, but just on my list as a woman who is always searching for those bright moments, those bright beacons along my journey. This one is up there, so thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. And I just want to take a moment and thank you. You have honored us. You've already done the work. You wrote the book, you did the writing, and yet you took the time to be here with us tonight, and you gave of yourself, talking again very intimately with us. And so thank you so much. It really was amazing. I also do want to thank the Prince George's County Memorial Library System, Loyalty Bookstores, and the Black Caucus of the American Library Association for partnering with us to bring this event to you all this evening. And Sistah Joy, Natasha Trethewey, like, this conversation was just extraordinary. And it was an honor to sit and to listen and be with you in conversation this evening. Thank you so much, both of you, for your time and your words. I also want to thank I want to thank all of the attendees as well. And I want to echo Sistah joy. If you haven't had the opportunity yet to read Memorial Drive or other poetry collections by Miss Trethewey, you can borrow them from Prince George's County Memorial Library System. You don't even have to live here to borrow them. They can hook you up with a virtual book card, library card, but also your local library or through Loyalty Bookstores, the library's partner bookstore. There is some other amazing programming that is coming up, including a Heritage Film Festival this Friday and Saturday, which you can learn about from the library's website at pgcmls.info/heritagefilm. And you can learn about other upcoming events by going to pgcmlsinfo.events. And again, I really thank you both so much for this absolutely amazing conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.